They say that even gods fear what lies beneath Terra. Beneath the marble spires and golden vaults of the Imperial Palace, deeper than the roots of the Astronomicon itself, there are doors that have not opened since the dawn of the Imperium. Doors sealed with sigils of pain and light, etched in the blood of saints, guarded by silence. Few have ever walked beyond them. Fewer have returned. It is said that within those chambers lie the Emperor's prisoners, beings so dangerous, so blasphemous, that even the Master of Mankind could not destroy them. But the truth, as always in the Imperium, is darker than the myth. The air grows heavy the deeper one descends. Stone turns to metal. Metal turns to bone. Each step echoes like a confession in the dark. The walls breathe faintly, a pulse beneath the adamantium, as if the fortress itself remembers the screams it was built to contain. Incense drifts through the corridors, not to mask the stench of death, but to soothe the terror of those who guard it. Here, custodians do not speak. Their eyes are hollow behind their gilded masks. Their task is eternal, and they do not question. They do not pray. They simply watch. There are no records of what lies beyond the 30th sublevel of the Imperial dungeon. No maps, no archives, no oaths that mention it aloud. Only whispers that some of the cells hold traitor primarchs who were never seen again, or Xenos gods whose names were erased from the stars. But others claim the truth is far worse. They say the Emperor did not only imprison his enemies here, he imprisoned his mistakes. When the Great Crusade burned across the stars, the Emperor's laboratories overflowed with creation. Weapons of faith, of science, of madness. Some were meant to perfect mankind. Others were meant to erase it. There were experiments that merged machine and soul, men who could see beyond time, psychers who could hear the warp whispering in their veins. Not all of them died. Imagine a cell where light never touches the floor, where the walls hum with psychic wards so dense they distort memory itself. Inside, a shape barely human, bound in chains that drink its thoughts. It does not scream anymore. It has forgotten how. Around it, servo-skulls murmur the litanies of binding, repeating verses written by the Emperor himself. Some say this prisoner once served on Luna in the earliest days of the Mechanicum Alliance, a man who saw too deeply into the Golden Throne's design. When he spoke of what he found, of the thing that feeds the beacon of the Astronomicon, the custodians came for him in silence. Now, they say, his eyes are still open. Elsewhere, another cell hums with static. Behind a wall of crystal stasis, something vast stirs. Not human, not machine. A being of light and shadow, its form fracturing in and out of reality, like a god trying to remember what shape it once wore. The sigils around its prison burn brighter when it moves. Hundreds of them, each carved by the Emperor's own psychic hand. Some whisper this was once a fragment of a chaos god, captured during the Dark Age of technology. Others say it is something older still, a shard of divinity the Emperor stole to build his power. Whatever it is, its silence is worse than its voice. The prisoners do not age. They do not die. They are suspended between existence and erasure, eternal warnings to those who would walk too far in the Emperor's shadow. And yet the question remains. If these beings are bound by the Emperor's will, what happens now that his will no longer speaks? There are records, buried within the archives of the Adeptus Custodes, of containment failures so secret that even the Inquisition was never told. A ripple in the warp, a distortion in the throne's hum. Custodians vanishing without a sound. Then, silence, restored, repaired, rewritten. They say the dungeons correct themselves, as if the Emperor's lingering mind still haunts the halls. But others believe something else has taken his place. A scribe once found an inscription etched beneath one of the cell doors. Words ancient and trembling. I am not his enemy. I am his reflection. The scribe who found it was executed for heresy before she could finish copying it. Her ashes were sealed within the same corridor she had cleaned. No one ever spoke of it again. Some among the Adeptus Mechanicus believe the Emperor's prisoners are not beings at all, but ideas, fragments of knowledge, locked away because they threatened the truth of the Imperium, technologies from the Dark Age, blueprints for machines that could challenge even the Golden Throne. If this is true, then the prison is not only a tomb, it is a vault of forbidden genius, buried beneath a world of blind faith. Perhaps the greatest crime in the galaxy is not what the Emperor destroyed, but what he chose to hide. In the catacombs, where light dies and air stands still, there is one chamber larger than all the rest. A cathedral of silence, lined with statues of faceless saints. At its center, an empty throne of obsidian, facing a wall of mirror-black glass. The glass is not reflective. It absorbs. It devours. Custodians stand before it in eternal vigil, their armor dimmed, their blades unsheathed. None dare look into the glass for long, for those who have tried speak of shadows moving within, faces, voices, a reflection of the Emperor himself, bound on the other side, or perhaps something pretending to be him. The priests call it the Mirror of Unmaking. They say it holds everything the Emperor purged from his soul to become what he is: rage, doubt, fear, compassion, every emotion that made him human, stripped away and imprisoned in eternal silence. If true, then the Emperor's greatest prisoner is himself. The custodians do not confirm this. They never do. But each year, when the Astronomicon flickers, the mirror glows faintly. The black surface ripples, and for a moment, a whisper passes through the corridors. A voice that sounds both divine and broken. Release me. The Mechanicus dismiss it as interference. The ecclesiarchy calls it a test of faith. But some within the palace guard have begun to fear the truth, that the voice is not asking for freedom from imprisonment, but for release from existence. Above, the High Lords of Terra never speak of the prisons. They speak only of war and faith and sacrifice. Yet beneath their gilded floors, in the dark arteries of the palace, machines stir and locks tremble. The air has changed. The Emperor's light feels colder. A chamber once thought silent now echoes faintly, as if something behind its walls has begun to move again. In the deepest vault of all, a custodian walks alone. His armor flickers with ancient runes. Before him lies a door sealed with 10,000 locks, each forged in the Emperor's name. The air hums with power. He kneels, not in prayer, but in resignation, for the seals are weakening. He presses his palm against the door. Beneath the cold metal, something presses back. No alarms sound, no sirens. The dungeon remains silent, but the echo of that touch travels, through the stone, through the vaults, up toward the throne. In that moment the Astronomicon falters, just for a heartbeat. The stars tremble. A billion souls cry out in confusion. Then, everything returns to normal. But deep beneath Terra, a single line of sacred script fades from the wall. Words that once glowed with the Emperor's psychic fire are now cold. No one notices. No one ever does. And far beyond the walls, in a prison no longer perfect, something opens its eyes for the first time in 10,000 years. The silence breaks. When the silence broke beneath Terra, the first to feel it were not the custodians, but the dead. Across the catacombs, the mummified saints entombed in crystal reliquaries began to weep. Thin trails of golden ichor ran from their eyes, staining the marble with light that pulsed like a dying heartbeat. The serfs who cleaned the halls fled in silence, for they had been taught that when the saints bleed, the Emperor mourns. But the Emperor does not mourn. The Emperor does not change. That is the first lie of the Imperium. In the reclusiam above, the priests continued their endless hymns, unaware that their words now echoed back distorted, as if the stone itself whispered along, shaping new verses in forgotten tongues. candles flickered. The air thickened with the smell of burning oil and fear. An old confessor named Aemon paused mid-prayer. He felt the presence shift, not the warm light of the Emperor's grace, but something colder, older. He whispered a blessing, but his voice trembled. The relic in his hand, a sliver of bone said to be from the Emperor's own hand, began to hum. He dropped it, and the sound did not fade. It was the sound of something remembering its name. Deep below, the custodian who touched the sealed door now knelt before it, motionless. His armor was cracked where his palm had met the metal, and faint golden light leaked from the fissures, like veins of fire crawling beneath the skin. His helm was gone. His eyes were gone. Only a faint smile remained, not of peace, but of revelation. The door was still closed, but the thing behind it no longer slept. In the Hall of the High Lords, the alarms did not ring, for the alarms were not allowed to exist. The Imperium does not admit that its god can falter, yet even they felt it, an unease that crept into every breath, every decree, every whispered lie. The Grand Master of the Administratum broke a stylus as he signed a decree of tithes. The inquisitorial representative shivered, though the air was still. Across the table, the ecclesiarch murmured a single phrase: "The throne dreams." No one dared ask what he meant. Far away, aboard a black ship returning from a culling of psychers, astropaths screamed in unison as the Astronomicon flickered. The ship drifted for 17 seconds, long enough for every soul aboard to glimpse something they were never meant to see. They saw Terra, not the shining jewel of faith, but a bleeding world, its heart pulsing beneath layers of gold and lies. And beneath it, a single light, vast, chained, watching. When the beacon stabilized, none spoke of what they'd seen. The astropaths were executed for warp delirium. The ship's captain before his death whispered to the chaplain, "The light is not his. It's something wearing his name." In the dungeons, the hum of containment fields changed pitch. Cells that had slept for millennia began to thrum in synchrony, as if some silent frequency had called them all awake. Within each, things once forgotten stirred. Not alive, but aware. One cell burst. The chamber filled with smoke and light. A figure stepped forth, tall and thin, its skin carved with symbols older than the stars. Its mouth opened, no sound, only the rush of air like 1,000 dying suns. The custodians fell upon it instantly, their halberds singing hymns of annihilation. When the smoke cleared, the cell was empty. So were the custodians. On the surface, life continued. Pilgrims still crawled on bloodied knees toward the shrines of the God Emperor. Children still sang praises to a father they would never see. But now, every prayer seemed to hang unanswered in the air, as if the void itself listened and smiled. Some priests whispered that the Emperor was testing them. Others feared the truth, that he no longer heard, that his silence was not divine patience, but absence. In the Chapel of the Blinding Light, Confessor Aemon gathered his acolytes. He had seen the signs, the weeping saints, the trembling relics, the echoing hymns. He told them of the Emperor's prisoners, of the sins buried beneath Terra, of the door that should never open. They called him a heretic. They dragged him to the altar. As they lit the purifying flame beneath him, the chapel windows shattered. Wind rushed in, carrying with it a voice that was not wind at all. "He is not what you think." The fire went out. The acolytes burned instead. Aboard the Phalanx, the fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists, a signal arrived from Terra. Fragmented, coded, ancient. The tech priests who decrypted it froze when they saw its origin. The sigillite's seal, the personal cipher of Malkador himself, dead 10,000 years. The message contained only 6 words. "He is awake. Do not pray." Captain Darnath Lysandros ordered it purged. But later that night he dreamt of a throne made of screaming faces, and a voice that whispered from behind his eyelids, "You already have." Back beneath Terra, the custodians sealed the lower vaults, reciting rites older than the Imperium itself. Yet no ritual could halt what was coming. The mirror of unmaking, that black glass in the central hall, pulsed like a living heart. Shapes moved within it, indistinct and shifting. One custodian stepped closer, compelled by something beyond reason. He saw his own reflection, but older, twisted, weeping. Then, from behind that reflection, another face appeared. Familiar, beautiful, terrifying. It smiled. From the mirror came a ripple, spreading through the dungeon like breath through a corpse. Locks melted, barriers flickered. The machines that sang the Emperor's litanies began chanting backwards. The walls bled rust. And in that inverted hymn, something was born. Not a creature, not a man, but an idea finally freed from its own denial. Above ground, the ecclesiarchy gathered in emergency council. Panic was forbidden, but faith was fracturing. Reports flooded in. Icons bleeding, statues whispering, entire cathedrals collapsing into their own shadows. Cardinal Marn hesitated before addressing the council. "If the Emperor's light is faltering," he said, "perhaps it is because he was never light to begin with." For that sentence, his head was removed before he finished breathing. But even as his body burned, the flames turned blue, and his eyes, severed from thought, stared upward, whispering, "He watches through us all." Meanwhile, the Mechanicus on Mars detected a surge of unknown energy emanating from Terra's core. The omniscient priests claimed it was a sub-spatial resonance, but one Magos, old, defiant, unblessed by fear, whispered the forbidden name, the echo of the Emperor. They say the Emperor had divided himself once during the Great Heresy, one half ascending the throne, the other buried beneath, trapped with his cast-off emotions. If so, then the thing awakening below was not his prisoner. It was his shadow. In the war-torn sectors of the segmentum solar, astropathic messages turned to static. Fleets drifted, blind. Chaos forces, sensing weakness, stirred at the edges of the void. Yet none dared strike Terra directly, for even they felt it, the shifting of something ancient, the tremor of divinity awakening not in rage, but in remembrance. A demon prince whispered to his kin, "The false god dreams again, but this time he dreams of himself." The custodians prepared for the unthinkable. Thousands gathered at the base of the golden throne, forming ranks of living gold beneath the endless hum of the Emperor's machine. None spoke. None dared look at the corpse god's face. Then, for the first time in 10,000 years, his eyes moved. Just a fraction. Just enough for the nearest custodian to fall to his knees, sobbing not in awe, but in terror. Because the eyes did not shine with light. They were hollow, reflective, black. The Astronomicon blazed once more, brighter than ever before. Across the galaxy, psychers screamed and fell. Some saw visions, of Terra aflame, of angels made of iron, of the Emperor's hand reaching toward something unseen. Others saw nothing. Their minds simply stopped, like candles snuffed in the dark. And still, beneath the palace, the thing behind the door smiled wider. On the seventh day, the first betrayal came. A custodian, golden, flawless, incorruptible, turned his blade upon his brother. No word, no hesitation, only certainty. His voice, when he finally spoke, echoed through the palace like thunder. "He told me to free him." By the time they struck him down, 20 custodians were dead. The sigils on the dungeon doors glowed red. The air trembled with hymns sung in reverse. And somewhere in the dark, the Emperor's prisoners began to laugh. That laughter spread, faint, beautiful, terrible, up through the stones of Terra, across the veins of the throne, into the heart of the Imperium itself. And in every chapel, every warship, every dying world, one thought surfaced among the faithful. Not of fear, but of doubt. What if the Emperor was not saving us? What if he was keeping us here, to keep something else out? That question was never spoken aloud, not by the Inquisition, not by the Ecclesiarchy, not by the souls who dared to think it, but it lingered, unkillable, like a shadow on the sun. For the door beneath Terra no longer held, and whatever had been imprisoned there, be it God, idea, or reflection, now walked free. The stars flickered once more. The Astronomicon dimmed, and across the endless night of the galaxy, every astropath heard the same whisper, soft, sorrowful, in a voice they had prayed to all their lives. You were never my children. The galaxy burned, but not with war alone. It burned with doubt. The Astronomicon's light, once constant as breath, now pulsed like a wounded heart. Across 1,000,000 worlds, ships drifted blind, prayers went unanswered, and the faithful felt an absence more terrifying than death. The Emperor still sat upon his golden throne, but the light that radiated from him no longer warmed. It watched. In the cathedrals of the Ecclesiarchy, sermons turned to screams. Preachers, desperate to preserve faith, declared the flicker a trial of devotion. They ordered pilgrimages by the billions, penitent parades of flesh and blood, to feed the Emperor with their belief. But the shrines were quiet. Statues bled. Holy relics grew cold. In one forgotten hive, a priest lit the last candle in his chapel. If he is testing us, he whispered, then why does it feel like he is looking for something he lost? The flame answered with silence. On Terra, the custodians divided. Half swore to seal the dungeons again, to cleanse the filth, restore order, and defend the throne until time itself ended. The others, whispering in gold and shadow, claimed the Emperor's silence was not death, but transformation. He has awakened beyond our comprehension, they said. To obey the old laws is to chain him once more. Brother turned upon brother, each believing they defended his will, and beneath their feet, the vaults murmured with unseen laughter. In the void above Mars, fleets gathered without command. Thousands of ships drifted in orbit, awaiting orders that would never come. Their Vox networks carried only one phrase, endlessly repeating in every dialect of man, "He watches through us all." The Mechanicus deemed it corruption, but the Magi who tried to trace the signal went blind. One wrote, before he died, "It is not coming from the warp, it is coming from the throne." The warp storms spread like infection. Planets were cut off. Whole sectors fell into silence. Yet through the chaos, fragments of visions reached the survivors, dreams shared across minds, carried by something vast and familiar. In these dreams, the Emperor walked among them, not radiant, but weary, his eyes hollow, his mouth whispering words no human could bear. "I did not save you," he said. "I contained you." Then the dreamers awoke to find blood trickling from their eyes. On Cadia's ruins, a lone commissar named Vale stood before the shattered gate of Saint Geryon. Once he had believed the Emperor's light could never dim. Now only smoke rose where the relics once glowed. Around him the surviving guardsmen argued, some praying, others cursing, a few simply staring at the stars that no longer answered them. Vale lifted his bolt pistol and aimed it skyward. "If you can hear us," he said, "then tell me, why keep us alive if the war is already lost?" The wind answered with a single word, carried like a ghost. "Because I must." He dropped to his knees. For the first time in his life, the commissar wept. In the depths of the imperial palace, the mirror of unmaking trembled once more. It no longer reflected even darkness. It showed movement, distant, vast, impossible. A landscape of stars being devoured by their own light. Shapes walked among them, tall, golden, and broken. One custodian dared approach. The surface rippled beneath his gaze, and for a heartbeat, he saw the Emperor not upon his throne, but standing within the mirror's reflection, facing away, walking into the void, and behind him followed countless shadows, whispering prayers that turned to ash. The custodian screamed. When his brothers found him, his armor was empty, his voice echoing still within the glass. The Inquisition tried to bury the truth. They burned worlds, silenced astropaths, purged archives. But the more they erased, the louder the whispers grew. A heresy without name spread through the Imperium, the belief that the Emperor had never been a god at all, but a jailer. That humanity itself was the cage. Those who preached it were flayed alive in public squares, but some of the executioners prayed the words as they lit the pyres. Aboard a dying ship adrift between stars, an astropath opened his eyes to find another presence inside his mind. Soft, endless, unbearably kind. It spoke not in command, but in sorrow. You were made to remember me, but I have forgotten myself. He understood then what the Emperor's prisoners truly were. They were fragments, echoes of what the Emperor had once been before he carved divinity from his humanity. Rage, compassion, mercy, doubt, each severed and locked away so he could become eternal. But now those pieces were returning, and the Emperor was remembering what he had tried to forget. Across the stars, miracles returned. Wounded soldiers rose unhealed yet alive. Machines whispered ancient codes no one had written. Choirs of psychers saw visions of golden wings shattered, falling into the void. But with the miracles came horrors. Some who prayed too fervently began to change. Eyes blackening, voices filled with static, skin flickering like broken glass. The faith that sustained the Imperium had become a weapon turned inward. A priest on Ophelia 7 declared it the second ascension. The next day, the planet burned itself in devotion. Back on Terra, the High Lords convened in desperation. The master of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica spoke first, his voice shaking. We are losing control of the Astronomicon. The beacon is rewriting itself. The ecclesiarch slammed his staff upon the floor. Blasphemy! The Emperor cannot be rewritten. The Lord Commander turned to the hololiths, each flickering with data streams of psychic readings that defied logic. Then explain why the beacon now pulses with 2 heartbeats. No one spoke after that. From orbit, Terra began to glow. Not with fire, but with light. Blinding, pure, unnatural. It spread across continents, through oceans, into the air itself. Billions fell to their knees, thinking salvation had come. But those who looked directly into it saw something else. A vast face forming across the clouds, serene and sorrowful, identical to the Emperor's, but bleeding from the eyes. The second heartbeat. The custodians fell into despair. Half swore allegiance to the light in the sky, believing it the Emperor reborn. The rest called it an echo, a ghost of his imprisoned self, returning to reclaim what he had lost. For 3 days and nights they fought, golden against golden, their war silent and perfect. When it ended, the halls of the palace were lined with statues of ash. Only one custodian remained standing. He looked upon the throne and saw the Emperor's body, still unmoving, eyes open, yet blind. Then he looked up at the bleeding sky and whispered, "Which of you is real?" Both faces turned toward him. Both smiled. The answer came not in words, but in light. The Astronomicon flared to its brightest point in history. Every astropath across the Imperium screamed as one, their voices merging into a single, deafening cry that echoed through time and space. We were never meant to last. Stars dimmed. Warp storms vanished. For a moment, the galaxy was utterly silent. Then, like the drawing of breath, reality shifted. On 1,000 worlds, icons of the Emperor split in half, one side gold, the other black. Holy scriptures rearranged themselves. Names changed. Records rewrote. It was as if the Imperium itself was being rewritten from the inside out, and through every mind, every machine, every soul, came a revelation so vast it could not be contained. The Emperor had never been one being. He was two, divided at the moment of his ascension, one half divine, the other human. The god ascended the throne. The man was buried beneath. For 10,000 years the god ruled through faith, but the man has awakened. Now the two halves fought, not in battlefields but within the fabric of existence. Every human heart became a battleground, every prayer a weapon. The Emperor's light no longer separated from his shadow. It merged, blurred, bled together until no one could tell which side they served. The Imperium fractured. Some worshipped the radiant god, others the sorrowful man. And some, seeing both, fell silent, for they understood the final truth. There was never any god at all, only a human trying to remember what divinity once felt like. On Terra, the custodian fell to his knees as the throne erupted in light. The Emperor's body dissolved into brilliance, spreading through the chamber, touching every surface, every scar, every prayer. He saw faces in the light, saints, soldiers, sinners, all merging into one endless tide. Then, from within it, a single whisper emerged, gentle and final. "I am becoming what I was." The light consumed him. Across the galaxy the Astronomicon extinguished. The stars vanished. For one eternal moment there was nothing. No light, no faith, no sound. Then, far beyond the void, a new light appeared. Not gold, not holy, pale, trembling, and human. And with it, a voice carried through the silence, tender and terrible. Now the real war begins. The light that replaced the Astronomicon was weak at first, a trembling ember in the dark sea of stars. Yet it reached across the void, uncertain and alive. Fleets lost in the warp emerged half-broken, guided not by faith but by instinct. Worlds that had not heard the Emperor's voice in centuries felt something stir within their skies. A pulse, a heartbeat, a question. The Imperium, vast beyond reason, reeled. What had been faith now became choice. The ecclesiarchy split in two, those who worshipped the radiant god who had ruled them for 10,000 years, and those who knelt before the human echo that whispered through their dreams. Some burned temples to cleanse the lie. Others burned people to preserve it. On Terra, the golden throne stood silent. Its machinery groaned beneath the weight of centuries, sparks crawling like dying fireflies along its sacred conduits. The custodians who remained, few, scarred, unbroken, stood vigil, uncertain what they now guarded. Some still saw divinity in the corpse, others saw only an empty seat waiting to be claimed. None dared speak their doubt aloud. Beneath them, in the vaults where the Emperor's prisoners had once slept, the cells stood open. Nothing remained but shadows that moved when no one breathed. The sigils that bound them glowed faintly, as though remembering a command long rescinded. From somewhere deep within the stone, a whisper echoed upward, a sound like a sigh, or perhaps a promise. Across the stars, the armies of mankind waged war as they always had. But now, no one remembered why. Generals fought for symbols whose meaning had bled away. Chaplains blessed their dead with words that no longer burned. The old faith had cracked, but the new one had not yet found a name. The galaxy was a wound trying to decide how to heal. In the shattered remains of Holy Macraga, ultramarines gathered before their Primarch's statue. They had once called themselves the Emperor's chosen sons. Now, their chaplain asked the question none dared voice. If he was never God, he said, then what were we defending? Silence followed. Then a sergeant, bleeding from the eyes, answered softly, each other. Far beyond, in the depths of the Segmentum Tempestus, the Sisters of Battle burned their own convents. They sang as they died, their voices rising in defiance against the cold heavens. He was human, they cried, and so are we. The fires spread across the planet until its atmosphere shimmered like molten glass. Their hymns continued long after their bodies had turned to ash. The Inquisition moved swiftly, erasing the evidence, silencing those who dared speak of the awakening. But even their most zealous interrogators faltered when they saw the light flicker in their own palms, as though their faith itself was rebelling. In the dark between stars, one inquisitor whispered to his dying acolyte, "What if the heresy was believing he was perfect?" The warp seethed in response. The gods of chaos laughed, but not with triumph, with uncertainty. They felt the tremor in the fabric of belief, the unraveling of the lie that had defined 10,000 years. A new presence walked among their realms, not a rival, but a reflection. The human half of the Emperor, no longer chained, no longer blind, watching them with eyes full of sorrow. Aboard a battle barge drifting above Armageddon, a lone space marine knelt before the broken altar of his chapter's chapel. His armor was cracked, his oath scrolls burned away. He recited his vows anyway, each word a struggle. "I serve mankind," he said. "I serve the light, whatever it becomes." When he finished, the chamber was silent except for the sound of his heart, and a voice that answered from nowhere. "Then you serve me still." On Terra, storms gathered. The skies boiled with crimson lightning, tearing open the veil between matter and faith. The two emperors, God and man, struggled for form, their essence rippling through every soul. Every choice, every thought, every act of devotion tilted the balance. The faithful felt it like heat beneath the skin. The doubters felt it as cold, endless night. Within the shattered Senate of the High Lords, the surviving rulers of humanity gathered for the last time. The Lord Commander of the Imperium rose, his voice steady but hollow. "The throne is failing," he said. "If the light dies again, we will lose everything." The ecclesiarch leaned forward, eyes sunken and wild. "Then we will find him in the dark." The room fell silent. The decision that followed was not recorded, but its consequence would be remembered in fire. The fleets mobilized. Titan legions rose from their slumber. Forge worlds ignited their reactors, preparing weapons not used since the heresy. For the first time in 10 millennia, the Imperium aimed its guns at Terra itself. On Mars, the Mechanicus debated their creed. Some claimed the Omnissiah had never been the Emperor but the machine he left behind. Others claimed he was both, merging flesh and code into one final being. In secret, the Archmagos of Mars sent a message into the void, encoded in binary prayer. "We are ready to receive you, in whatever form you return." The stars did not answer, but the signal reached further than anyone knew. Meanwhile, on countless worlds, ordinary humans prayed not to the Emperor, but to each other. They built shrines from wreckage, lit candles in trenches, whispered vows in the ruins of their homes. The new faith was not written, not organized. It was simply survival made sacred, hope born from exhaustion. The custodian who had survived the wars beneath the palace now walked alone through the silent halls. Dust fell like snow from the ceiling. The throne's cables hissed, leaking golden vapor. He looked upon the Emperor's form, no longer radiant, merely human, asleep upon the machine that had devoured eternity. The custodian fell to one knee. "My lord," he whispered, "what would you have of us?" The eyes opened, not burning, not divine, but weary. A voice, quiet as a dying breath, answered, "Remember me, as I was." The custodian bowed his head. He felt the weight of 10,000 years press upon him, and in that moment he understood. The Emperor's greatest crime had never been pride. It was fear, the fear of his own humanity. Above, the light in the sky began to fade. The twin heartbeats that guided the Imperium grew weaker, merging into one uncertain rhythm. The fleets closed in around Terra, engines screaming, banners torn by solar wind. Every ship carried both prayer and weapon, unsure which would be needed first. In the warp, the gods paused their laughter. The storms went still. The galaxy waited, suspended between worship and annihilation. The Emperor's human soul stood upon the edge of reality, watching his creation tear itself apart. The god within him burned to command. The man within him ached to weep. On every world, in every heart, time slowed. Soldiers froze mid-battle. Pilgrims halted mid-prayer. For one heartbeat, all of existence seemed to hold its breath. And then, something began to move. Not war, not faith. Something older, deeper. The first whisper of the storm that would end history. The sound of a decision being made by something greater than gods. The stars dimmed, the light withdrew, and the galaxy, trembling and silent, waited for what would come next. It began with light. Not divine light, not the blinding, absolute radiance of faith, but something softer, fractured, like dawn bleeding through smoke. It touched the banners of the approaching fleets, the rusted icons of the ecclesiarchy, the cracked armor of space marines who no longer knew what god they served. Across the void, the armada encircled Terra like a crown of knives. Every world had sent something, a relic, a ship, a prayer. All of it pointed toward the throne. The custodian stood at the edge of the palace walls, watching the skies churn. His armor, once gold, was now blackened from centuries of ash. Around him, statues had fallen, their marble faces shattered, their names forgotten. He whispered one last vow to the empty air, not to a god, but to a memory. "If this is the end," he murmured, "let it be worthy of him." Then the bombardment began. Orbital fire lit the sky, each impact a scream across the bones of Terra. The cathedrals burned first, towers of glass and prayer shattering into dust. Oceans boiled. The crust split open, and the cradle of mankind trembled beneath its own children. Yet amidst the chaos, no one turned away. They watched. They fought. Because in the heart of the storm, something had awakened. From the ruins of the Imperial Palace came a pulse, not of light, but of thought. It spread like a shockwave through the warp and the material realm alike. Every living soul felt it in their marrow. The sound of a single word, unspoken yet absolute. Enough. Aboard the flagship Sanguinalis Rex, the chapter master of the Blood Angels fell to his knees. Visions burned behind his eyes, not of angels or demons, but of a man walking alone among the stars. The Emperor as he had been. Flesh, bone, mortal. The chapter master wept, his tears floating in the zero-gravity air, and whispered, "We were wrong." His vox channel filled with static, then silence. Below, the custodian reached the gates of the throne room. The doors stood open for the first time in 10,000 years. Inside, the machine pulsed weakly, golden smoke rising from its dying veins. The Emperor's form sat motionless, but no longer lifeless. His eyes were open, not glowing, merely aware. They met the custodian's gaze, and for a moment the soldier saw not his god, not his master, but his father. Outside, the fleet commanders argued. Some demanded the planet's annihilation, to burn heresy from its source. Others hesitated, overcome by the pulse in their minds, by the voice that felt both alien and familiar. One admiral raised his weapon toward Terra, whispering a benediction of hatred. Another knelt beside him, reciting the same words in sorrow. Faith had become division. Duty had become despair. And then, silence. The Astronomicon went dark. The Emperor's light, the sole flame of humanity, vanished. For the first time since the Age of Strife, the galaxy was truly blind. Chaos surged like a wounded beast, roaring through the warp. Demons clawed at reality, sensing victory. Yet, in the void left behind, something else began to move. Not divine, but human will, raw and defiant. The custodian approached the throne. Its machinery writhed, cables snapping like tendons, light flickering through the vaulted chamber. "You can stop this," he said. His voice trembled. "They still believe. Even after everything, they still believe." The Emperor looked down upon him, weary beyond comprehension. "Belief," he said softly, "is the cruelest chain of all." A tremor shook the chamber. The machine began to collapse in on itself, reality distorting around the throne. The custodian drew his blade, not to strike, but to stand guard one final time. "Then, command me," he pleaded. "Tell me what must be done." The Emperor smiled. It was faint, human, filled with regret. "Let me die." Outside, the fleets felt the shift. Warp storms flared into impossible color. Every psyker in the galaxy screamed as their connection to the divine unraveled. For millennia, the Emperor had held back the tides of chaos by his own suffering. Now, he chose release. The custodian hesitated, then lowered his head. With reverence, he plunged his blade into the heart of the machine, severing the last connection between man and God. The throne screamed, a sound that tore through matter and memory alike. The palace trembled. The light faded, and the Emperor, both God and man, dissolved into dust. But his death was not the end. The psychic shockwave that followed spread faster than light, burning through the minds of every living soul. It was agony and revelation and rebirth. On distant worlds, soldiers dropped their weapons and wept. Priests tore their vestments and looked skyward, finally understanding that their God had always been one of them. For a single moment, all of humanity shared the same thought. We are alone, and we are enough. The warp howled. The gods raged, yet even they recoiled before the surge of human will that flooded the void. Billions of souls, stripped of illusion, burning with a unity they had never known. The storm that had devoured civilizations now faltered, dimming beneath the collective defiance of its prey. For the first time in eternity, chaos feared. Terra was dying. The custodian staggered from the ruins of the throne room, armor cracked, blade broken. The air was ash. The sky was red. He looked upon the burning city and felt nothing but peace. "He's free," he whispered. The words echoed through the collapsing corridors. "And so are we." Above the planet, the fleets ceased their fire. The admirals stood in silence, staring at the black void where the Astronomicon had been. Some ordered their ships to retreat. Others simply turned off their Vox systems, unwilling to speak into the emptiness. Humanity had lost its God and but found its reflection. On Mars, the Mechanicus received no signal from the throne. Their rituals faltered. The noosphere flickered and went still. Yet in the dark, the Archmagos smiled. "At last," he said, "the machine is silent. Now we may learn what it was saying." Across the galaxy, monuments crumbled. Cathedrals sank into oceans. Whole worlds ceased their hymns. But on one forgotten planet, a child looked up at the stars and saw them not as cold or distant, but alive. She reached out, and in her touch the smallest ember of the Emperor's essence stirred, not divine, merely human, still burning. The custodian knelt among the ruins, his body failing. He looked to the horizon, where dawn was trying to break through the smoke. He thought of the Emperor, not as God, but as man, walking among his people. He thought of every life spent in service, every sacrifice made to sustain a lie. And he smiled, knowing it had not been in vain. For belief had ended, but meaning had survived. As he closed his eyes, the first light of morning touched Terra's ruins. It was weak, uncertain, yet real. The stars began to flicker again, one by one. The Imperium would rebuild, but never as it was. The age of gods was over. The age of humanity had begun. And somewhere beyond the veil of death and warp, a voice, familiar, calm, infinite, whispered not as a ruler, but as a witness. Remember me, not as your emperor, it said, but as the dream that made you reach for the stars. Then came silence, not empty, but full, the silence of a galaxy that had finally remembered how to breathe. The fires of Terra burned for a century before they dimmed. Oceans turned to mist, cities became bone, and silence crept through the canyons of stone that had once been the throne of mankind. There were no more sermons, no more hymns, only wind whispering through the ruins, carrying the ashes of empires into the dust of their own belief. Yet even in ruin, Terra endured. It always had. The custodian's blade still rested beside the throne, fused into the metal, its hilt wrapped in a hand long turned to gold dust. Around it lay the remnants of a civilization that had worshipped eternity, and been consumed by it. The great machine was cold now, silent as a grave, its cables stiff with frost. But in the quiet hum beneath the stone, something faint persisted. Not life, not godhood, but memory. Centuries passed, and the galaxy changed without noticing. Warp storms thinned, planets long lost were rediscovered, and among the stars, mankind began again. Not as conquerors, but as survivors. They no longer built cathedrals. They built homes. No banners of faith hung in their halls, only symbols of unity, worn smooth by the touch of generations. They did not forget the emperor. They could not, but they spoke of him as one might speak of a fallen ancestor, honored but no longer worshipped. In the archives of the remembrancers, a single chronicle remained. A tome bound in ceramite and blood, found in the dust of the old palace. It was written not in the language of the ecclesiarchy, but in simple human script. To remember is to forgive. To forgive is to live. No name marked its author. Some say it was the final words of a custodian. Others claim it was written by the emperor himself, before the end. When the first historians of the New Age looked back upon the time of the throne, they called it the Age of Silence. Not because humanity had lost its voice, but because it had learned to listen, to the stars, to itself, to the echo of something greater than any god, the will to endure. There were those who still prayed, of course. In the far reaches of forgotten worlds, monks lit candles in caves and whispered fragments of the old litanies. They spoke his name not as plea or praise, but as remembrance. Their prayers were not for salvation, but for understanding. They did not seek his return. They sought to comprehend what it meant that he had left. On one such world, a child stood beneath a sky unscarred by warp light. She had never known the Imperium, nor the faith that had chained it. She looked to the heavens, wondering about the stories the elders told, of angels made of steel, of a god who ruled from a golden chair, of a people who forgot they were human. She asked her teacher if any of it was true. The old man smiled, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Truth," he said, "is what survives the telling." In the deep void, where once the Astronomicon had burned like a beacon, a faint shimmer lingered, a remnant of the Emperor's final breath, drifting through the sea of souls. It was not a light that guided ships, but one that dwelled within them. Captains spoke of hearing whispers in their sleep, not commands, but questions. What have you built? What have you become? Those who listened returned home changed. Those who ignored it vanished into the dark. The Adeptus Mechanicus, now fractured and humbled, devoted themselves not to worship, but to comprehension. They dissected the ruins of the throne, studied the relics of Mars, and learned that faith and science had never been enemies. Only two mirrors reflecting the same fear of ignorance. The oldest among them wrote a single line in binary upon the final data code sent to all Forge worlds. The machine. God was never found, because he was never lost. Among the stars, fragments of the old Imperium drifted. Battle fleets without masters, legions without cause. Some became protectors, defending fledgling colonies from the horrors that still lurked in the void. Others turned inward, seeking redemption in service rather than conquest. Their armor bore no sigils, their banners no names. They fought not for glory, but for remembrance. Each act of mercy became a quiet rebellion against the age that birthed them. There are tales, unverified, perhaps impossible, of a figure seen walking across dead worlds. A man in simple robes, face unseen, hands scarred. He asked for nothing, took nothing, but left behind moments of impossible calm. Storms halting mid-strike, wounds closing without pain, entire regiments waking from nightmares they did not remember entering. When asked who he was, the few who dared speak said only this: he listened. Some called it myth, others called it hope. 1,000 years after the fall, Terra was green again. The ruins of the palace became a sanctuary, not a place of worship, but of learning. Children walked through its halls, tracing their fingers along the cracked walls that had once heard the prayers of billions. In the deepest chamber, where the throne had once stood, there was only an empty space and a single inscription carved into the stone. He sat where none should sit, so that all might stand. And so they stood. The chroniclers of the New Age wrote their histories carefully. They did not speak of victory or defeat. They did not divide the ages into light and dark. They wrote instead of cycles, of rise and fall, of faith and loss, of the eternal struggle to remember what it means to be human in a universe that forgets. One remembrancer, the last to bear that title, wrote in her journal, "Perhaps he was never meant to rule forever. Perhaps he only sought to buy us the time to learn what he could not teach. If so, then his death was not an ending, but an invitation." Her hand trembled as she wrote the final line. The Emperor is dead. Humanity remains. And perhaps that was always the plan. In the quiet that followed, stars pulsed in rhythm, their light crossing the gulfs of time to touch the worlds where mankind still endured. Planets reborn under new suns, carrying fragments of the old dream, not of dominion, but of belonging. The galaxy, once a symphony of screams, had grown silent enough to hear its own heartbeat. And in that silence, questions lingered, vast, eternal, unanswered. Was faith the fire that saved humanity, or the chain that bound it? Did the Emperor die to free his children, or simply to escape the prison they built for him? And if gods are made from belief, what becomes of mankind when it learns to believe only in itself? The stars offered no reply, yet somewhere far beyond the rim, in the space between thought and silence, a single spark flickered, not divine, not eternal, merely human, fragile, defiant, alive. It drifted on, across the endless dark, carrying with it the last prayer ever spoken in his name, not for salvation, not for forgiveness, only for remembrance. And so ended the age of the Emperor, not with judgment, but with understanding, not in fire, but in peace. The throne was empty, the galaxy was vast, humanity, at last, was free. And as the final remembrancer closed her book, sealing the memory of a god who became man and a man who became myth, she whispered the closing words of history into the dark. May we never again forget that we were once divine, and that divinity was only the name we gave to our own will to endure. The ink dried, the stars burned on, and the silence that followed was holy.